Yeah? All right. Okay. Welcome to this session workshop. Can I get the slides, please? All right. Thank you. So this workshop on ESM in clinical practice, where we're going to discuss a little bit how we could use digital technology in the everyday clinical practice and what kind of things we need to do or can do for that. It's a workshop, so I'm not just, that's also why I'm standing here and not over there. I want to make it a bit more interactive, so I'm going to ask you guys some questions as well. Of course, I will also show some things that we've done. So basically, I'm talking about experience sampling. And for those of you who were not attending my talk earlier, I will shortly introduce it again. So basically, it's built, or it's within the field of contextual psychiatry, the idea that symptoms do not just occur out of nothing, but that also people live in a certain environment, have a certain context, and that the interaction with that context is relevant in when symptoms occur, and that it would be helpful if we could find ways to assess and measure that, to understand the circumstances in which symptoms arise. So this is, therefore we're using the experience sampling method. We've written a paper on that in 2018 in World Psychiatry. And basically, so the methodology is that we ask people to provide self-reports on their current mental state, on their mood, their symptoms, the context in which they arise several times a day, over a number of days. So basically at random times they get a signal and they're asked to fill out a short questionnaire about that current moment. How do you feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel lonely? Do you feel insecure? Do you feel happy? Also symptoms. Do you hear voices that other people cannot hear? Do you feel suspicious? Do you feel that other people want to harm you? But also context. So we're interested to know, like, where are people? What are they doing? Whom are they with? How do they experience that context? So with this methodology, we basically have the opportunity to measure people in their daily life and have also access to the context. So this is a sort of more detailed explanation of that. So basically we ask in sort of time, like we ask it at a random time, but it's not fully random because then of course you would have the risk that all the beeps come in the morning. So we make it semi-random, so we have blocks of, depending on how many beeps we use, either 90 minutes or 2 hours. And then somewhere at a random moment in that block, we ask a question. And of course, that is during people's normal daily lives, so in different contexts. When they're having at home their morning routine, then they're commuting at work, commutes, meeting friends, dinner, watching TV, for example. And so it really allows us to examine these mental health problems as they unfold in real life. So you see, you can actually measure the fluctuation in symptoms over these different moments. You can relate that to the daily life context by asking these in brief questionnaires. And so we started a few years ago the Building Bridges initiative, where we said, okay, ESM is interesting as a research tool. We use it to gain novel insights into mechanisms and experiences of psychopathology. I have been using this for, I guess, 25 years or so. where we started with just a diary, a booklet and a pen and a very ugly watch that was able to, that we could program and that would emit signals. Of course, at that moment it was a research tool. Now, with the digital technology, we can also potentially use it as a clinical tool. And the idea is really to provide a better understanding of clients' mental complaints in everyday context. And so the theoretical idea is that it would help us in getting a better understanding of what is happening to our patients. Because basically what we mainly have to rely on is we speak to our patients, maybe every week, every 2 weeks. We ask them, how are things going? And that's where we're stuck. That is the best we can do. A big problem of that is retrospective bias. A big problem is that people, that the current mental state will very much influence the way people remember the past week or the past few weeks. So if you have a good day, you probably remember the past week as more positive than when you're having a bad day. Another problem with retrospective bias is that if you already know the outcome of an event, your memory of the event is going to be different. So when I'm driving my car and suddenly in the weather it's a bit icy and suddenly my car starts spinning, my memory of my anxiety in that moment is going to be different if it just spins and then it stops and I continue driving, or it spins and I crash into a tree and something dramatic happens. So my memory of that actual moment is going to be different. So the fact that you already know the outcome influences your memory. Also, we ask something quite different because difficult because we ask people sort of in general, like how they are doing, but there probably have been good moments, bad moments. There's probably a lot of variability. And it's very difficult to capture that variability if we're not actually measuring it. So there's lots of limitations in what we currently do. And so the question is, can we use this tool to improve that in clinical practice? And so in order to do that, we have to, if we really want to make this a clinical tool, it's only going to help if we very closely engage end users in the development and testing of this tool. Because as I also said in my talk earlier, we can develop something that works very nicely, but if clinicians are not interested in using it, if it doesn't fit within their clinical workflow, it's not going to happen. If clients or patients are not interested in using it and find it way too complex and difficult, it's not going to happen. So we need to construct something that, from a theoretical stance, makes sense, is potentially helpful, but also that clinicians are willing to use, that end users are, that patients are willing to use, and that also fits within the clinical management system. That's like that, also on a management level, that people are willing to invest in this and include this in their workflow. So that's why we set up the Building Bridges project, where we basically want to transfer ESM from the lab to the clinic. And so what we've done is we started with focus groups with both clinicians and patients, asking them what they need, how they would use it. We developed a platform and we've developed content for that. We piloted it and optimized it, and then we evaluated efficacy. So ESM has been used in mental health research quite a lot to study person-environment interactions in all different kinds of populations, in people with affective disorders, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, ADHD, borderline personality disorders, psychotic disorders. And when I talk to clinicians and researchers alike, when I say, well, I study psychotic disorder and we've run a lot of studies, and people always say, oh, but my patients couldn't do this. Oh, you're probably talking about like the more highly functioning patients but that's actually not the case. A lot of people can do this because it's very structured. You get a signal and you fill out a questionnaire. And also, the questionnaire is quite easy. It's much easier than we usually ask because people don't have to generate over moments. They don't have to give a global impression. They just have to say, right now, I feel anxious. Right now, I feel lonely. Right now. So in that sense, it is quite feasible. Of course, there will always be people that don't want to do this. It doesn't fit everyone, but it's not so much related to severity of symptoms, I would say. So it has been used in mental health research, but then the question is, of course, how can we translate this to clinical practice? It has been used in research, so for example, we see that there is variability. So we have shown that you can ask about hallucinations, for example, and that they vary from moment to moment. So this is one participant. You see it's a score of 1 to 7, a Likert scale. There's moments when there's no hallucinations present, but also moments when it's quite high. Also in paranoia, we see really variation from not being present at all to very intensive moments. This is just within one day. Of course, this is interesting because it has been known from work such as that of Richard Bentel and Daniel Freeman that, for example, delusions vary over time, that the intensity varies. But what we've shown is that it really varies from moment to moment. Within one day, at some moments, people are very much feeling paranoid, and at other moments, they're fine. Hallucinations vary from moment to moment. And so what we want to understand is actually what drives that pattern. What happens here when people become more paranoid, for example? So we found, for example, that at moments when people feel more anxious, when they have a drop in their self-esteem, when there's an increase in stress, that are the moments when they're most likely to have more paranoia. So if we can use this methodology to capture that variability and to understand what drives that variability, maybe that also provides us with targets for treatment. Maybe if we want to deal with paranoia, then we have to deal with anxiety, or we have to work with self-esteem. So it provides targets for treatment. Now, what was an interesting finding for us was that group findings are not predictive for individual findings. So what we did was we looked at this association between mood, for example, mood and self-esteem, and paranoia. And then we, rather than looking at the group level, we looked at each of these individuals separately. And of course, with experience sampling, you can do that because you have a lot of data for each individual. You don't have 60 beeps. If someone fills out all the beeps, then you should be worried because then there's probably OCD going on because you're in traffic, you're in the swimming pool, under the shower. There's lots of moments that you cannot fill it out. But on average, we have about 75% of the beeps available. So we have quite a lot of information from each individual. Now, what we found was, so I said we had an increase in anxiety, a decrease in self-esteem. What we found was, for example, if we look at association with anxiety and paranoia, that for some people, anxiety preceded paranoia. For some people, it was the other way around. They first became paranoid, then more anxious. For some people, an increase in paranoia actually decreased their level of anxiety. For some people, there was no association at all. For some people, there was no variability in one of these items so that you couldn't actually look at an association. So whereas at the group level, the association is very clear, on the individual level, it's very different for every individual. And that is interesting because what we work with is group findings. When we give psychoeducation, we teach patients what we know based on group findings. So if a patient here would say, oh, for me, anxiety is not related to psychosis, we would make a little note in our clinical file, no insight. But this patient does have insight. For this particular patient, there is no association. So basically what we teach in psychoeducation is group findings that may not be relevant for the person sitting in front of you. And so the nice thing of using experience sampling is that you actually can give individualized psychoeducation. You're not talking about the average person. You're actually looking at your own data, and you can see what is relevant for you. Is anxiety for you a predictor of psychosis or not? So we're running a lot of studies in research. For example, we're running the Sigma study, which is on mental health in about 2,000 Flemish adolescents. We're running the CORE study, which is on stress sensitivity and recovery. The DAILY study, which is on self-injury in young people. The INTERACT study, which is on stress and reward in people with psychosis, and then interventions. So we're running a lot of studies in mental health. We have been running a lot of studies in the past, but how can we actually implement that to the clinic? In order to implement that, we need two things. On the one hand, we need the questionnaire. So we need, this is very sensitive. So we need the self-monitoring in daily life, where we basically ask people, have a questionnaire on the app, where we ask people to self-report their experiences. But to make this clinically relevant, we need something else. We also need a dashboard where we can actually look at those data. We have to make meaning of the data. And that is actually a dashboard where the patient and the clinician can look at together, and where we actually have the detailed information on that functioning. That is what we need. So basically, for the digital self-monitoring in daily life, we have a questionnaire where we have momentary mood items, where we have momentary context items. So here is, for example, I feel stressed, anxious, lonely, etc. Context items, location, where are you, activity, what are you doing, social. And for example, you can also use it to assess sleep, like what is the subjective quality of your sleep. So this is the one thing that we need. But then we also need a dashboard. And the question is how to optimize this visualization. Because of course, we have a lot of data. We have a lot of variables. And we could say, here, you clinician, here is your bag with variables. You can associate everything with everything. Good luck. It's not going to happen. So you need to think about good ways to visualize this data and sort of find a balance between, on the one hand, pre-processing everything and just providing the feedback that you think is relevant, or make it more open so that the clinician and the patient can decide what to look at. So it's finding a balance between personalizing things and, on the other hand, preparing the information. So for example, here, this is positive affect, which is a combination of positive feelings. Things such I feel relaxed, I feel happy, I feel well. And negative affect, which is a combination of negative feelings. I feel anxious, I feel insecure, I feel down, I feel lonely. And then you can look at, for example, the association over time between these two mood items. So you can see how was the average mood over time, what were the days when people felt better, what were the days when people felt worse. You could do something similar for symptoms, psychotic symptoms, but of course other symptoms as well. But then we also look at mood and symptoms in relation to different contexts. So you actually want to see, is there a relationship between how people feel and the context they're in? So for example, here we provide the association between how people, the context they're in, the social context they're in, and their positive mood. So I now see that there is some Dutch there, so I'll translate that for you. So for example, how do they feel when they're on their own compared to when they're with friends, compared to when they are with people they don't know? How does that affect their positive and negative affect? But you could also look at certain activities. How are certain activities related to certain mood? We can also provide an overview of the daily context. So how much of your time are people spending alone versus with others? How much of their time do they spend in certain activities? How much of their time do they spend in certain places? So it gives quite a rich data set. But still, it is really a challenge for us to find the best ways to visualize this data so that clinicians don't need to train for like 3 weeks to make sense of this. So that is really one of the challenges. And so that is really what we are interested in. We want to have a questionnaire and the tool, and then we want to see how we can implement it. So we did focus groups and with users to think about benefits and disadvantages. And so as this is a workshop, I want to make this a bit interactive and not just me speaking. So maybe the first question that I would like to ask you is to maybe brainstorm with me a little bit on what would you see as a potential benefit of using this method in the clinic. How, if you think about your own clinical practice, how would you think, what could it bring? What would it, how could it be helpful? That's, any ideas? You get a microphone.
We can collect a lot of data for the study, and we can use for all data for big data analysis, like machine learning, deep learning. It is very hard to collect all data for classical methods, with classical methods. Mm-hmm. But we can use this for big data.
Definitely, definitely. But would that be particularly relevant in the clinic, or is that more research, in addition to the research? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, definitely. I fully agree. This is very relevant data for deep learning and machine learning. But the immediate clinical application of that maybe is still so moving back to the clinic, how could this be helpful in the clinic? How could it help you? What could you learn from it? Any ideas?
We may provide interventions for individuals,
Yeah.
Treatment strategies for this person.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think.
yeah, definitely. It can provide treatment strategies. Yeah. Other things?
We saw the patient only 1 hour, for example, mostly, or 15 minutes in Turkey. It is better when you see the patient one after, which there is much time of we don't know what the patient did, and we can monitorize how the system going on in the brain.
Do you think that is that particularly relevant when you see the patient again, or would you also be interested in using this to sort of check on your patients when you're not seeing them?
It is very paranoid, but it is good, I think. When, for example, when you take the patient in the room, you can take the data of the system, and you can see, you know, what the patient did before the examination. Maybe it is better to direct the therapy, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
We talk.
Yeah, exactly. Other things to think of? All right, thank you. Do you see potential barriers, problems? What would be problems? Anyone? You see problems?
There may be server problems for platform or security problems for the patient's data, and we need software engineers for this project, like this projects. Maybe it's hard for the clinicians to deal with all these issues.
Yeah. So, if I understand correctly, you say there's technical issues,
Technical issues for,
but also for the patients themselves, it may be difficult to.
they need some technological devices.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It deals with technology, so they need a device. The technology needs to work. It needs to be integrated in the hospital system, or the data need to be protected. So yeah, definitely, there's issues on that. Other issues, barriers that you see?
For the first question, it is useful for to pass the limitations of cross-sectional evaluation, especially in forensic psychology and psychiatry. And the barrier we couldn't have observation. We shouldn't exclude the simulation, maybe, in descriptive phenomenologic evaluation.
Yes, yeah. So basically it's self-report, there's no one observing the patient, and yes, that definitely is true. Yeah. There was some barriers here as well. Wait a second.
Maybe patients are usually tend to avoid from difficult situations and emotions, so maybe especially when they are in difficult situations, they usually avoid to entering data. Maybe.
Yeah, so maybe you don't get all the relevant information that you're interested in, that the missingness is not at random, but actually is at moments when you would actually want the information, yes? Okay, similar point. All right, thank you. So we also asked that at a group of Belgian psychologists and psychiatrists in focus groups, and we found some similar answers to what you said and some additional ones. So we basically run 5 focus groups with 36 clinicians in different mental health care settings. And so basically they identified that as a positive thing, it would give better insights into the client's problems, which was also mentioned in the group here. One of the things that wasn't mentioned here is that this may also be a good strategy to evaluate treatments, because you have such an extensive data set, not just on symptoms, but also on functioning, that, for example, when you start a new medication, it would be helpful to use this method to really see after a couple of weeks, like what really changed. And maybe symptoms went down, but if people are still just sitting in their house, not leaving their room, not having social contacts, having low positive affect, then maybe the intervention is not as successful as we thought, based on just the fact that symptoms reduced. Or vice versa, maybe symptoms may still be there, but if people become more active, reach out to other people more often, in general have more positive affect, then we still could consider this a good intervention. So it gives a bit more a detailed way of evaluating interventions and also evaluating negative side effects. So you could really also see maybe a bit sooner what potential side effects are, for example, in lack of motivation, more negative affect, things like that. They, of course, also identified problems. So one problem that wasn't mentioned here is that people find it are afraid that it's quite a burden to clinicians as well as to patients. And I don't know how it is here, but as I heard from you suggesting that you usually see your patients for 15 minutes, I assume it's quite similar, that clinicians say, well, we are very pressured, we only have a limited amount of time, so this is all very interesting, but this is not helping us, it's not making things going, and especially if we have to invest more time in it, it's not going to be helpful. What other people also said was that it lacks scientific evidence, that we need more evidence base before we can trust these methods more. And that also there is an issue with regard to payment. Like, who is going to pay for this? Is there financial governmental compensation? Is it part of the assurance? Is there reimbursement? Who is going to pay for this is an important question. Also, what clinicians said that they would need and that they would, what would be helpful for them to make it more helpful is that they would like to make this more personalized, that they would like to make this more adjusted to each individual. For some patients, some symptoms are more relevant than to others, some social contexts are more prevalent, etc. So they said it would be nice if we could personalize it. They also wanted to have additional functions, such as a crisis plan, so that when people indicate that they have lots of symptoms, that maybe already a crisis plan is presented to them on the phone. Also, this is one I just missed as a positive thing. Yeah, screen for psychopathology, so it's a bit in line with what you said, sort of keeping an eye on your patients, both when they're with you, but also at times when you're not seeing them. So how do you think patients feel about such a tool? Any ideas? Would your patients be willing to do this, do you think? Any guesses?
They may feel appreciated for detailed assessment. and their clinicians intensive care for their treatment.
Yeah, yeah. Taken more seriously, or like feel that they're really, on the one hand, taking more seriously. On the other hand, maybe also sort of becoming more active in the treatment, being more actively engaged would be one of my hypotheses. Any other?
Some adolescents maybe don't want to check out all time, maybe motivation problems, maybe they don't want to give answers.
Yeah.
One problem is that. Another is maybe they can get secondary outcome from their symptoms. Maybe it's another problem, maybe. Overrated.
What do you mean with the secondary outcome?
For example, I am working on forensic medicine in Turkey. Some patients give more mistaken. Maybe they may simulate their symptoms. For example,
Okay.
like this.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is not going to work if patients don't want to share. Then you're not going to, you can't use it as a sort of, oh, we found it. So it's when patients are willing to share, definitely, yeah.
Maybe it's hard for people to touch their emotions or observe their insights, experiences.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. So we also run 2 focus groups with 9 people with lived experience of psychosis. And, well, this is specifically on psychosis, but we later on will also talk a bit more about the broader transdiagnostic group. So they said, well, it can be helpful in preventing to derail into, so when it helps us sort of detect subtle changes or abnormal patterns earlier, it can help us to make it worse. But also they said that they think it will help their self-awareness, that they can actually see how this can make them more aware of their own patterns, that it can improve self-management by getting more insight in their own problems, and that it increases their autonomy. But they also saw problems. Actually, it's interesting that the patients themselves said, is this reliable? Are we reliable sources of information? But also mainly the burden and the adverse effects, a bit related to what you said. Like, is it sort of innocent to be, for example, if you then see on your screen that you have felt bad all week? So how confronting is that? They also said it would be helpful if it can be more personalized, so that it's really about my experiences, not about experiences in general. And they also were in favor of additional functions, such as adding a crisis plan, but they also said maybe passive monitoring can be included. So passive monitoring meaning that rather than them having to say everything, that, for example, instead of asking where are you, we can use sensors to actually locate where they are, or so have an integration of more passive sensing and active filling out. All right, so we identified some benefits and disadvantages, and then we were looking at feasibility. So we field tested a prototype to investigate how it fits into the daily life context. And then we also investigated how it influenced the mental health care. So this is the impact. We then moved on to the IMPROVE study. And the IMPROVE study, we included 12 clinicians and 25 patients. These were all patients of the clinicians. So the clinicians that participated were asked to ask their patients to participate. It's intended to be a pilot study, so it's not the big numbers yet, but we just wanted to check everything we had. So basically the intervention is a startup session where the clinician explains to the patient what they need to do. Then the patients do 6 days of self-monitoring, and then there is a data feedback session. So the patient goes back to the clinician, and then they discuss together the findings. It's part of a study, so we assessed before this intervention and after this intervention. If we think about different clinical professions, who do you think would most easily use this in? So when we think about psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, case managers, mental health nurses, who would use this most? For whom would this be most relevant? No idea? All of them? Primary care physicians? That's very optimistic. Well, actually, this was just a small pilot. As I said, it was only, let me check, 12 clinicians. So we have to test this further. But what we found was that actually it was most used by the clinical psychologists. We had 3 psychiatrists involved, and although being very motivated, none of them managed to include 1 patient with this method. Maybe that is just, like, as I say, it's just a small sample, or maybe it's an indication that it fits better in the clinical workflow of the clinical psychologists and some case managers as well. But again, I mean, no strong conclusions on this yet. This is very exploratory still. All right, so in the end, then we did the field study. Here we ended up with 8 clinicians. So this is going back. This is where we started. So these were the patients. We included 12 clinicians, but then in fact we only got results of 8. So the 3 psychiatrists did not include any patients, and we only ended up with 8 patients. So again, pilot data. Okay, so this is a startup session, so the clinician has to inform the client about the app, the IMPROVE app, and the clinicians and the client discuss personalization of IMPROVE. Now, what was very interesting was that only very few clinicians discussed personalization with their clients. Now, remember that this was seen as one of the biggest benefits, or the extras that we needed, was personalization. So we had sort of a core set of items that we asked, and then clinicians could pick additional items, and they could discuss that with their client, and they could add them to the questionnaire. And that hardly ever happens, because they said, personalization of tool is important, but it requires extra time and effort. And so again, that also is about feasibility, right? So you can say, well, optimally, it would be an optimal instrument if we could really personalize this, but then it's too complex. People don't do that. They just use the standard form. And so, of course, that's something to think about when we develop something. And that is why this phase is so important, because we can do focus groups and people can say, oh, I would want this and that, but then we have to test it in practice and see, do people use that? Because here, this is a nice example where, in theory, personalization would be optimal, but in practice, costs so much time, people don't use it. Then we had the client self-monitoring. So the client have to self-monitor independently for 6 days. And here we found that the client compliance was mixed. So we found the best client compliance in inpatients, which is interesting, but also maybe a little bit disappointing, because it's usually outpatients that we would be most interested in, because these are the patients that you don't see in your clinic. You only see them for the 15 minutes. So their compliance was a bit lower. It's also interesting for us because when we do experience sampling in research, we have on average a compliance of 75%, meaning that people fill out 75% of the beeps that is presented to them. Compliance in the clinical practice is slower, and that probably has to do with many reasons. One reason is that when we do it for research, there is a research assistant who's very much trained in explaining this and going over. It's their job, they have time to do that in detail. Much less so, of course, with the clinician. That could be one of the things. Often people get paid in research for providing their answers. Of course, here they don't. On the other hand, you could say here it's much more relevant for the patient because it's about their own treatment. We also saw clearly differences between clinicians. Some clinicians would also monitor the compliance and the responses. And so I think it's also a little bit about the interaction, of course, between the clinician and the client. So clients would say, well, I did not always have my phone with me. That's why I did not respond. Some clinicians said, I checked with clients when I saw something was not going well. Of course, you can imagine that then compliance is higher for those patients, because when something is not going well, or they forget, or they lose motivation, their clinician is calling them. Other clinicians didn't do that. So definitely there is an issue there. Then we have the feedback session, where the clinicians and the clients review the data together. What we saw was that many clinicians already had a look at the data before they met with their clients. And there was sort of a mixed opinion of the data feedback. So from a clinician perspective, some said, I found it really difficult to make sense of the data. Whereas others said, I tried to make a coherent, not study, story of the data. And so for some clinicians, it worked really well. They really tried to look at the different outcomes and looked at what is for this clinician relevant, for this patient relevant. Other clinicians found that much more difficult. From the patient perspective, they said it's interesting, but it's also confronting. To go into that a bit more in detail, so we had the startup session, self-monitoring data session feedback. If we really look at how it was used, how Improve was used, we actually intended to have the recruitment of clients starting with a face-to-face startup session, where actually the clinician would explain what needs to happen. We saw that there were a lot of practical challenging in these face-to-face interactions. Of course, we also have to say that this pilot happened during COVID, which of course already limited face-to-face interactions. And so often the clients were enrolled. So this is how it works basically, as it's still part of a study. The clinician agrees to participate, signs informed consent. The patient is asked, agrees to participate, signs informed consent. The clinician then enrolls the patient in the monitoring system. And then what we saw that happened is that often automatically then the 6 days started without having the patient properly explained what they had to do. So that might be one of the reasons why compliance was lower. And again, as I already said, personalization was often not discussed or incorporated. So then we had the self-monitoring week. And so these are some of the comments we got. I struggled to respond to notifications on time. This is an interesting comment because we give the beep and then people are expected to respond within 10 minutes. If they don't respond within 10 minutes, it disappears. They cannot respond anymore. And so it is a bit of a question, of course. You can say, so patients say, I struggle to respond in time. You could say, well, why don't you give more time? Why not give people half an hour to respond? Is it so relevant that it's actually within that 10 minutes? That is a bit of a theoretical discussion. We're doing a lot of methodological work on this as well. The reason why we do things randomly is because then you try to capture all kinds of experiences, a bit as your comment earlier. So if we give people more time, they can say, well, I'm now in a difficult situation, I'll just wait with responding till in half an hour when it's more convenient to respond. So that is why you want people to respond at the moment. You could also say, why not let them respond 30 minutes later and reflect on the current moment? But that is what we saw in our methodological research, that the further they're away from the beep, the more they actually, so if you then ask them to remember the beep and fill out as what happened at the moment of the beep, the further they're away from the actual beep, the more there's sort of a regression towards their average scores. So that is not really helpful. So the question is then, and this is the strategy so far, like we just provide a lot of beeps and we accept that we have a lot of missings. But that still allows to capture different moments. So people said emotional reflection was both difficult, beneficial, and confronting. So difficult for people to respond to sometimes, beneficial to see what are your patterns, how does that evolve, but in a way sometimes confronting as well. And then some people said, I would have liked to add more detailed information. And that, of course, is, again, this sort of balance between personalization and, feasibility in a way. Because, of course, you can allow people to have lots of open questions that they just respond to, but then how on earth are you going to make sense of that and analyze that? So in that respect, in a new study that I will talk about in a minute, we now have created another option. We still have to test that, whether that works. But we now just, instead of having a list of other symptoms, for example, we just ask people to identify like 3 core problems that are relevant to them. And they can identify that in their own words. And then we just measure every time whether their core problem is present or not. So it's a way of trying to get a bit more personalized information, but we'll have to see whether that is going to be used. And then from the clinician side, so as I already said, some people monitored and followed up, and others didn't. Then the feedback session. Some people said it was really interesting to see my data. Reviewing the data with the clinician was overall a good experience, also sometimes confronting. In terms of visualization, some people said it was easy to understand the data visualizations. Other people said I needed the help of my clinicians to interpret the data. Then, from the clinician perspective, they said I looked at the data prior to the client session. I discussed the data with the client in the session. I tried to make a coherent story. Some people said I focused on specific elements. And other people said I struggled to make use of the information. And that is really something, as I already said, that we're trying to further develop. And so when you were talking about deep learning and machine learning, actually one of the things we're doing in our new study is using machine learning, or, well, we're testing it, we'll see, not so much to sort of get new patterns out of it, but rather to identify the most relevant outputs for that patient. So that using these deep learning techniques, we push forward those feedback that is most relevant. And of course, we're investigating that also, but so you could say probably the things where we see most changes would be, so that all the feedback is still available, but that rather than having to search through it yourself, that it's pushed forward, like what may be most relevant for that patient at that time. How did it influence the therapy? So what was the improved data used for? So the clinicians said it helped gain new insights and information from real-life data. It helped in mapping the client problems. It helped in reflecting and new perspectives, identifying focus points for therapy, and confirming hypotheses. So there was a lot of positive things that were identified by the clinicians. From the patient perspective, they said it guided positive changes in my daily life. And also, it helped me train emotional awareness. I became more aware of my feelings and my complaints. In terms of client activation and therapeutic alliance, some people said it had no or little impact. It did not. I did not experience any change in that. Other people said I felt more engaged in therapy in and outside of sessions. And that is, of course, one of the things that we're really aiming for with these sort of interventions. I think in psychiatry, patients are still often treated as very passive recipients. The clinician tells you what's wrong with you and then tells you what you have to do. And you're sort of a passive recipient of that, often making people resistant, non-compliant, etc. And so the idea of having people, giving this to people with a message like, you know, you're the expert of your own experiences. We need you to be an active partner in this process, makes people a very active, much more engaged in that in their therapeutic course. And so by giving this to patients, you make them active partners. This is also one of the things that we say. Patients are expert by experience. They're experts in their experiences, but they have very little tools to actually bring that expertise to the table. And with this, we actually provide them with a tool to bring their expertise to the table and to then discuss together with the clinician, like, what is happening in my life? when do things go wrong? What are risk moments? When do things go well? What is good for me? And to discuss that together. From the clinician perspective, some said in terms of client activation and therapeutic alliance, I didn't notice any changes. But there were also some that felt that it had moderate and great impact. So some said it encouraged clients to think along and engage in discussion. So you have much more a conversation rather than a one-way monologue. It creates a collaborative atmosphere, a modus of collaboration. You're working together in this. And some said it improves trust and therapeutic bonds. So some people felt that it was quite a positive thing, but not everyone. So do you think this would lead to more person-centered care? Who says no? Yeah.
For example, there's the big data, and I think it's like a EEG or ECG diagram, and how can we get the data, for example, P wave, QT wave, like this? I think it must be together at most big data to what is this curves. I think it's much time to effort, and for also in each different psychopathology or conditions, it has to be more engageable, more participatable data must get.
Yeah, bringing us back to the machine learning. So indeed, I think that probably what we need is a sort of combination of two things. One is big data sets of this kind of data where we sort of have training sets where general patterns can be identified and that then can be applied to guide individual interpretation of. So I definitely think there is improvement in this possible, but still already without that, we can already start to see relevant patterns. We have to be careful, though, with the statistics that we're using, because I know a number of people are now using network analyses to look at this data. But, and this is very interesting, it's a very interesting approach, but it's also an approach where we don't know yet how this actually applies to an individual. So there is this one very interesting study where they sent a set of ESM data to 9 different groups, asking them to identify like the relevant network, and they all came up with a different network. So showing that for clinical practice, this is way too early. We cannot, and I think again, also with the machine learning, we have to be careful, and so we've now chosen to just use basic statistics and be very conservative when we apply it to clinical practice. For research, it's great, and we can try out everything, but before we start using it in clinical practice, we have to make sure that what we say is true. And so with the networks, that's an interesting thing, because people use network analysis in clinical practice and don't realize that what they're doing is not really validated for clinical practice yet. As if another group looks at it, they come up with a different network. So then what are you doing? So what we now do is just use basic statistics. And of course, this is a challenge in clinical practice as well, because the clinician, like, you also have to be aware if people only fill out 5 beeps out of 60, then even basic statistics, you won't have the statistical power to say anything. But of course, you can't expect clinicians to know. So there needs to be some sort of, control on that as well. Like, when do these data become clinically relevant? That definitely is an issue.
I am also excited to know this application, but also.
Okay. But I think what is interesting in terms of person-centered care or personalized care is that, of course, this is mainly looked at, as you already mentioned, in terms of sort of biomarkers or one question that I have, or one argument, is that maybe biomarkers in psychiatry, well, we haven't been very successful with them. We haven't really identified biomarkers. So maybe this is another way of reaching that personalization, where we just look at individual patterns of behavior as a marker for personalized care. So just to end off, what we then currently have done is, so we've tested this, we have talked to clinicians and patients, but then the next question is how to get it really into the clinic. And so we were very lucky to receive a Horizon 2020 implementation project. So this is a project funded by the European Commission, where we actually could bring together a lot of expertise to combine sensor information from with phones, ESM, and a feedback system, as I just explained, and where we are going to investigate, on the one hand, whether implementing this will improve empowerment and engagement and self-management and recovery from the service user perspective, and from the clinician perspective, whether it will help them personalize targets for treatment, as well as improve shared decision-making. Because also in shared decision-making, one of the big problems is that you only can make a decision together when you have good information, that you have something to base your decision on. And so we argue that maybe by using this, this provides the clinician with, and the patient alike, with the information that they need to make sensible decisions. So this is the Immerse project, and this is basically a collaboration between 9 partners in Germany, Belgium, Slovakia, and Scotland. We have included different sets of expertise. So we will look at implementation of ESM in clinical practice in a randomized trial, because as we did in the Improve project, that was just a pilot, that's sort of the first step. Now we want to take this further, and we want to really do an implementation trial. So in 4 different countries with different healthcare systems, with different attitudes towards digital technology as well. Because, for example, Scotland is very advanced in using digital technology compared to Belgium and Germany, which are actually quite behind in applying digital technology, and then Slovakia as well. So we have sort of across the range of different uses. We also include in each country, we have an academic hospital involved, but also peripheral hospital to see whether it is usable across the board and what are the different implementation needs in these different sites. But next to that, we also have people with knowledge on ethical and legal considerations. We have people that know about technology, that know about interoperability. How can we make our device talk to all these different hospital systems? We have people working on machine learning. We have people who have expertise in stakeholder involvement and participatory research. So we have quite a broad range of expertise. Because what we want to do next is we want to overcome certain barriers, and this brings us to why does it not get integrated into the clinic? And I will not torture you anymore. I will just provide the answers, given the time. So what are the critical problems for clinical uptake? So one of them is technology and technology-enabled service. So a lot of times these technologies are developed, but it's not about the technology in itself, it's about how the technology fits within the service. So that's the technology-enabled service. So in order to do that better, we are building on the IMPROVE study, on the feedback that we got from clinicians and patients. We are also in the IMMERSE study. We're now in phase 1. We started in April. We have 4 years for this study. And in the phase 1, we are again inquiring, talking to patients, family members, clinicians, and healthcare management to understand and know what they need. But also this is about that interoperability. How can you use this in your practice with your electronic patient system? How can it communicate with that? Who owns the data? What about data security, privacy? So basically the strategy that we have right now is that the patient owns the data and allows you as a clinician to access them. So that also if a patient wants to change to another clinician, that the data are his or hers and he or she can take the data with her or him. So that is really one big thing. Another thing is legal and ethical. So there's a lot of regulations on medical devices. This is a medical device because it's, you will make this clinical decisions based on this. You will make clinical evaluations based on this. So it is a clinical device. So that is one big challenge to comply with all the regulations. But there's also other issues, legal issues and ethical issues. For example, what if your patient signals in the device that he or she is thinking about suicide and you don't see it? So is there, if it's mentioned somewhere, do you have an obligation to always see that? Do we need red flag systems in it or not? Like, there's a lot of things. Can you make a clinical decision based on these data? So these are also, it's really more the regulatory framework around it that needs to be investigated and developed, but then also within the different contexts. So we're doing this with 4 countries in Europe, well, Scotland technically not anymore, but anyways. But even in the other countries, legislation is different. So there's a lot of things we have to keep in mind. Then, of course, there's a lack of evidence base. This is only going to be, well, we can only really implement this if we also show that it's beneficial. So for that, we are running this clinical trial. It's going to be a clustered, randomized clinical trial. So basically, in all settings, we're going to include 3 wards. 2 will be randomized into the using ESM, and 1 will be randomized in just treatment as usual. So that means that we also going to see in the ward that is randomized in our condition, it's also really an implementation trial. So we're going to investigate how many of the clinicians in that ward actually use it. What do we have to do to make them use it? What do we need in terms of training material? How does implementation work? Because we really also want to learn how we can implement this further. And then we're going to include over 400 patients in all these settings, transdiagnostic. Everyone can be included, in and out patients, all diagnoses. But that is, of course, that we then, what we try to answer. And so the trial basically tests processes of implementation. So if no one in the end uses it, that is an outcome as well. Then it says that the implementation failed. So it's about process of implementation, but of course also outcomes related to these things that we suggested earlier. Does it improve self-management? Does it improve empowerment? Does it improve? So fortunately, that is gradually changing. So I think we really need to invest more in running these implementation studies, getting these things implemented in the clinic. Okay, so that is about what I wanted to talk about today and discuss with you. I already showed it earlier, but I'll show it again. So if anyone is interested in learning more about experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment from a research perspective, very clear, not from a clinical perspective, from a research perspective, we run workshops in Leuven, and the next one is scheduled 9, 10, and 11 of March. So there's still places, if people are interested, you can still sign up for it. And then we just got the Open Handbook of Experience Sampling Methodologies. It's an open handbook, so it's available for free. You can download it from our website, or you can order it from Amazon, which is just where you just pay the printing costs. That should be between 15 and 20 euros. Be careful, because the book has already been stolen, and people sell it for prices up to 60 euro. Don't pay that, then you're not. So just make sure that the vendor is Amazon, and then you get it at a print price. All right, and then I just want to again show a picture of my group. So this is the Center for Contextual Psychiatry. Obviously, I'm not doing this work all on my own. These are my postdocs, senior staff, PhD students, and support staff. All right. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions if you have further questions.
For assessment, emotional.
Can you start again?
Do you use any formula for assessment emotional variations for saying if there is a low variation, high variation, or mid variation? How we can assess this?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that is something that. So there's basically two things you can do. You can say you can compare the person to themselves. So you can actually look at changes over time, because also within Immerse, we're not gonna, we basically ask the, improve, we just did one session, 6 days. But that was just to test whether it's feasible, whether people could use it. In Immerse, the big study in Europe, we're actually asking people, they can use it for 6 months, but of course they're not gonna fill out this. So we ask the clinician to at least use it 2 or 3 times for 6 days in the first 2 months. And then afterwards they can use it at every moment when there is a substantial change in the treatment. For example, just before you start a new treatment, or after, or when you see that symptoms suddenly got worse, or like any sort of crucial points within the clinical course, we ask them to apply it. We, of course, still have to test how, we will see. So you basically can look at within person changes. You can see, is the variability higher in the beginning versus few weeks later, before, after treatment. So that is one way that you can look at it, at changes in association within the person. We're also looking at, can we provide some sort of norms so that people would know, like, okay, we see that kind of variability, or that level of symptoms, or mood, or whatever, and that is sort of comparable to a healthy population, or that is comparable to other people with the same diagnosis. we already collected quite a lot of data over time, so we have databases with, huge databases with lots of patients. And we also use a strategy, especially with relation to negative and positive affect, to use usually quite similar items so that we can actually create a norm. So that is something we're thinking about, to create sort of norm scores. But we're still discussing because, the within-person change to us seems more important than the sort of how it relates to other people. But still, I get your point. It's still an open discussion. We haven't come to a final conclusion yet. But I do think we have the data to actually create some kind of norms. Yeah, especially for psychosis, depression, and in comparison to healthy volunteers, because that are the two groups that we've investigated most.
Thank you. I want to comment and ask from about legal issues. Yes, suicide intention may be a problem, but on the other hand, the most common problem in malpractice context, lack of record. So system provide us record and may be protective. What do you think about?
Lack of?
Record.
So that it's not been, that people don't actually mention anything, or is that what you refer to?
Yes. Usually don't write something about patient on client. Especially in legal issues, this could be a problem, and the system provide record.
Okay.
Maybe protective from legal issues.
Yes. That's an interesting one. I haven't thought about that in that way. So that with this kind of data, you would actually say that it does provide records of what is happening to the patient. So in a way, it's a possibility for the patient to sort of record themselves what is happening. And yeah, that could be a good one. In that sense, we're also thinking about that interoperability, and that is why interoperability is important, so that we are looking whether. So the problem with relating this kind of information to electronic patient files is that electronic patient files are, of course, very highly protected. It's very, very sensitive data. And so they're very reluctant to open their gates to new information coming in from an app, because then, we are trying to develop our app very safely, but not everyone does, and then they sort of open their gates to, they give it out of their hands, basically. So that's why they're very reluctant. Almost no one wants to do that. So we're thinking of ways of not make it a two-way street, but actually just input information. And that could be indeed a response to that lack of record, because then you would, whenever patients provide information, it would automatically be reported. But yeah, that's one of the technical issues we're still struggling with. But in terms of legal, that indeed could be a strong point of this. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Well, I think I've done enough talking for today. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope it was in some way helpful or meaningful to you. Thank you.